We've heard today that dispersal notices have been issued across Manchester and other places like that. The riots have spread. We've heard headlines like prosecutors are on standby, are ready to, quote unquote, deliver swift justice with an extra 70 prosecutors available over the weekend. Joseph, let's start off with some of these legal issues around what's happening. First of all, tell us what dispersal notices are and what does it mean about having these special prosecutors on hand?
Okay, a couple of things going on. So first of all, this whole idea about things being geared in such a way that that justice can be delivered swiftly. Okay, so we've heard that prosecutors, as you mentioned, are on standby. I think the quote is ready to deliver swift justice. Sounds very dramatic, doesn't it, Trisha? An extra 70 or so of prosecutors to be available over the weekend. This is right, but it's not so draconian and 1984 as one might think, because, of course, law is just an operation. It's just a mass business and something that works according to the activity of people like anything else. So, for example, I think a good example might be a story I once read about the South African World Cup. Do you remember what a success all of that was? But they anticipated hooliganism because there is hooliganism as a result of football. It's inevitable. And they set up detention trains and large out-of-town police stations, detention trains, these mass trains for shipping out suspects to be interviewed and then to be charged. It sounds kind of almost calculated, but of course, when you're dealing with large numbers of people, you can actually start to predict behavior. And why is it, or how is it, Trisha, that you can predict this kind of behavior when it comes to this business? And that's because the social media prefigures the activity. You have these decentralized bad actors. Tommy Robinson, famed convicted fraudster, Stephen Yaxley Lennon.
Yaxley, I know. I don't know what name he is.
Absolutely. I tell you what, when he was in the magistrates' court getting convicted of fraud, they didn't say stand Tommy Robinson. They said stand Stephen Yaxley Lennon, because he's a criminal. He's a criminal and a dishonest criminal. And these types, they're reliant on algorithms to spread their message, but that means it's predictable because they're in the hands of how long that information takes to get through, and they can't predict where these actions will take place. These gatherings of morons in some respects, in some cases,
every time anybody says that anything like that, of course, people will jump up and say, why are we concentrating on his criminal background? Why? He's only saying what we want to hear and what have you.
I'll tell you what, Trisha, I'm sorry to cut across. You know, I'm sorry to cut across you, and I do it so so reluctantly, but, you know, I think I get the point, and it's not, do you trust somebody? I don't employ fraudsters in my organization. If I know somebody is convicted of lying, I am less likely to believe what they say. And of course, he was the one, an account linked with him was the one that was then posting information all about this 17-year-old boy who apparently had come on a boat and was an asylum seeker, none of which is true, because this is completely irresponsible. Of course, there is, at the same time, there are the idiots and there are the racists. Of course, they make up part of the cohort. There's also people who are misguided, who believe the stuff. And don't we regard somebody who's credulous and trusting as somebody who's generally probably a nice person? I don't criticize everybody who's angry about this because they've believed something that they've read. I criticize the decision to rely on it. These people make no mistake. Despite the populist and attractive messages, these are bad people. They're masquerading as fringe. Trisha, make no mistake, in my view, when there are people among them with swastikas as tattoos, hijacking St. George, a religious figure.
I don't understand. I don't understand, and people say just a few. I don't understand how, you know, lobbing missiles at the cenotaph and doing Zeekarl and you know, I know it's not everybody, but I don't understand how, you know, throwing stuff at Winston Churchill translates as a love of your country. Let me just ask you, what is this what is a dispersal notice then?
Well, we've actually talked about similar orders when we've been moaning about infringements and encroachments on civil rights over the past year and a half of Joseph's judgments now and again, you and I, Trisha. These are orders that have to be applied for in a magistrate's court where something is anticipated, or in some cases can be authorized by a very senior police officer where something is anticipated. That means that if somebody is reasonably suspected to be engaged in a specific, usually named activity, they can be ordered to leave. Didn't we have the case, in fact, of somebody a few months ago who was hanging outside abortion clinics? And a specific abortion clinic. Do you remember that story? It was an abortion clinic, and she was basically saying, I can't remember the details, wasn't it? Something that, God have mercy on your soul, or I'm praying. I'm just praying. I'm just praying. Of course, she wasn't just praying, but probably the police overreached in dealing with her in the way that in the way that they did. So these types of civil orders exist. They should be used sparingly. Liberty of the subject, all of that stuff. It's tremendously important. At the same time, we are looking at a situation where there is a social political phenomenon of people being misled by irresponsible, unchecked, is it journalism? No, it's...
Well, I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask you this. It's interesting. The Times actually did a piece about not saying the woman's name, but the woman who originally started this rumour off and got it completely wrong and is really mortified to see, says she's mortified. She's like an anti-lockdown and anti-this and conspiracy theorist. But, of course, she's seen how the grief... Can you imagine having your child killed by male violence only to see it, you know, the result being male violence? But she says she's mortified. Now, somewhere else in the Times, they actually name this woman. If somebody has passed on information that has caused such destruction because it was believed and then amplified by outside and maybe Russian and everybody else has jumped on it, can they ever be prosecuted? Is there such a thing as... because personally, I think if you do something, any of us does something that passes on, amplifies or comes up with something that, you know, people's houses, and we're doing a special on housing, the bricks of their walls, I don't understand how smashing up supermarkets and terrifying ordinary citizens and all of these sorts of things helps commemorate the the lives of little girls, one of which who was an immigrant herself from another country. I don't understand that.
I'm completely in agreement with you on this, and I think there's a couple of things going on. First of all, got a good friend from Liverpool, Amy, and I've been following what she's been saying the past few days, and the abiding emotions and the abiding expressions should be sadness and empathy and compassion. I've seen people locking hands outside mosques to say, you travelers coming to our community to stir up your hatred in your little dark places on the internet do not represent us. I think that's a point I really want to make, and I think it's the only good thing that I can see that's coming out of this is that there are communities who are saying we are affected by this. You do not represent us. With regard to things like contempt, however, and this is the question you're asking, well, the law doesn't generally punish things that are not intentional. One of the first things you learn in law school is mens rea. You need the guilty mind, but you need the guilty act. The guilty act on its own, doing something without having thought that what you were doing was wrong, is not usually enough for it to be criminal. That's a very broad opinion, Trisha, or a very broad analysis. But in more detail, when you look at, for example, contempt of court, if once something really becomes, even if you're guilty of it, or if you've acted in a certain way that you realize was foolish, there's a principle that if you purge that contempt, if you try to row back from it, or if the action that you've taken has gone beyond what you intended, then you're either not liable for it, or if you're liable for it, the way in which a court will look at it is fairly generous. And I think that's a manifestation of our general sense of fairness, which is probably the best thing, I would say, about our English common law system.
Okay, and you make a good point, because I love this. Pat, 74, she was in part of a crowd that read Nans Against Nazis, telling the Times she's been protesting against fascists since the National Front in the 1970s. John Wilson, 65, who's lived in Liverpool all his life, had come out to guard the mosque. The majority of people think this is a disgrace. So they're ordinary people with ordinary names coming out. And just finally, the judge agreed to release the name of the 17-year-old who was at the heart of this awful stabbing. And just briefly, give us the reasons why.
Well, there's a couple of things going on. Generally speaking, there's a general principle against naming someone who's under 18. We've talked about it before. Their youth, it's a different protocol because youths should be treated more rehabilitatively than adults. Why named in this case? And the judge, Andrew Maneri, we briefed him actually at our firm, Mary Monson Solicitors, as a barrister. He acted for both defence and prosecution, and he was well known as a fair man. However, in these circumstances, there is an overwhelming public interest because of the speculation. This is somebody who the far right were mislabeling as somebody who was operating with presumably some type of terrorist agenda, and somebody who was a migrant, and somebody who was a boat migrant, and all of that. The factual evidence as to whether the person's done it is not what's being commented on. This is about making sure that this general overwhelming public interest for law and order right now, and also probably for the benefit of this child defendant to be treated fairly, that if they're being mislabeled, it's probably worse in this case than even being named as a 17-year-old, which would probably, when they're 18 years old, I mean, that would be inevitable. They would be named.
And this is Axel Rudakubana. He's going to be 18 in a few days. His parents came from Rwanda, which is a mainly Christian country anyway. So, Joseph, thank you so much. I really, as I said, it's been great to have you look at the headlines and make sense of the real legal issues behind all of this. Joseph Kotrie-Monson there joining us today.